It is my great pleasure to be here for a conversation with Dr. Abbas Milani. Abbas Milani is the Hamid and Christina Mugaddam Director of Iranian Studies and adjunct professor at the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at the Friedman Spogli Institute at Stanford University. He is also one of the founding co-directors of the Iran Democracy Project and a research fellow at the Hoover Institution. Dr. Milani has published more than 20 books and 200 articles and book reviews in scholarly journals, in newspapers, and in magazines. And his latest book is a collection he co-edited with Larry Diamond, and the title is Politics and Culture in Contemporary Iran, Challenging the Status Quo. Dr. Abbas Milani is an expert on U.S.-Iran relations, as well as Iranian cultural, political, and security issues. So thank you for joining us this evening to talk about the nationwide protests in Iran with which we all greeted the new year. The protests, as everyone here knows, started on December 28th of 2017, and they started as a small street protest over high prices in the city of Mashhad, which is Iran's second largest city. And they rapidly spilled over into some 85 cities and towns, provincial towns. And although the protests had petered out by the end of January, they have been considered now the third largest protests in the history of the Islamic Republic, which should make them well worthy of attention and of analysis, even while we recognize that we are still very close to the events, and so perhaps some types of analysis are still not possible. But we are not historians, we are political scientists, and that gives us a little bit of a luxury in engaging in analyzing events closer as they happen. So let's start by discussing how you would characterize these protests from the lens of the people's identities who participated in them, as well as the content of their demands. So today, what do we know so far about who these protesters were, what were their expressed demands, and what do the location of these protests reveal?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your introduction. Thank you all for coming. The demonstrations haven't completely petered out. I think one of the things we have to recognize, and one of the things that describes them, is that they have essentially continued. We are today, as we speak, in the midst of a very serious set of events by Iranian women who are taking remarkably brave action on an almost daily basis. So the notion that imprisoning about 4,000 people, as the regime did, and killing a couple of dozens, we don't know the exact number, has petered out the movement, I think is misreading it. But it began essentially with the failure of a bank, a small bank, of which there are several thousand. There are banks only in name. There are Ponzi schemes. They're run by the religious forces, and they have cheated people out of millions and millions of money, promising them interest of up to 40, 30%, and then running away with people's money. One of them failed in the city of Mashhad. The price of eggs increased in the city of Mashhad, and there were demonstrations. Soon, they spread to about 80, some would say 100 cities. Some of these cities are cities that an Iranian had never heard, unless they were experts in geography. The city of Izeh, the city of Nahavand, these are small towns, often known for their piety, never known for their political radicalism. The city of Khomeini Shahr, people took to the streets and burned the seminary in the city of Khomeini Shahr. These were essentially unemployed, urban, poor. Completely different than the category of people who took to the streets in 2009 to protest the elections. That's what I think made this, for the regime, a remarkably challenging set of protesters. They couldn't accuse them of being, although they eventually did, they couldn't have accused them of being tools of Israel, tools of the United States. These were the downtrodden. These were the poor that the regime has claimed to represent. Now they were shouting death to the regime. They were shouting death to Khamenei. They were shouting, we don't want Syria, we don't want Lebanon, think about Iran. These are very serious challenges.
Great. So you've mentioned that these are different than the 2009 protests, and I'd like you to elaborate more on how exactly they're different, and also perhaps, so I started by mentioning that they're now considered the third largest cycle of protests. And so the other large protests took place in 2009 in the aftermath of the election, and then the third sort of large cycle of protests were the ones that happened in the early 1990s. And so could you, discuss the current protests in relation to these two other cycles and how you would place them comparatively and historically?
If I may, I would add a fourth cycle of protest, which to me has been the most important. And that's the cycle of protests by Iranian women who have fought for 39 years for equality, for the right to wear the clothes they want. They have organized, in my view, a movement, a sustained, continuous movement of civil disobedience that is comparable to the anti-racist movement of the African Americans in this country. It hasn't been recognized, but it is a remarkably relentless, slow-moving, wise movement. So we have that as, in my view, one of the most important instigators, if you will. It is the Iranian woman, in my view, that have broken the air of authoritarian authority and power and invincibility. It is they who have shown you can fight this regime and you can defeat it. Iranian women are remarkably, in my view, the champions of this. Truly, I honestly think they haven't been recognized because they have fought a very different, sustained, wise, prudent, non-ideological, non-utopian movement. They want to change small things, but those small things have added up to a very, very big movement. The way this last cycle, I think, was different was from 2009. 2009 was essentially an urban movement focused in big cities, Tehran, focused in upper neighborhoods of Tehran, centered essentially by the urban, educated, technocratic class. The women's movement were very active in that one as well. And it had a leadership. It had a green movement as its ideological leader. It had Mousavi and Karoubi and Mrs. Rahnabad as its symbols. And the question was very simple. What happened to my vote? They were opposing what they considered a rigged election. They were opposing what they thought was the forced selection or election of Ahmadinejad. This time, there is no organized leadership. It is spontaneous. It is in a different social class, and it is spread throughout the country, almost 100 different cities. Some people have put the number as almost 100. So it is much more diffused, and very quickly, what began as essentially an economic set of demands morphed into radical political demands. Demands for an end to Islamic Republic, demand for what people call an Iranian Republic, demands against Khamenei, and it became much, much more radical. I think the regime has tried to contain it, but I don't think the end of the problem is near, because what begat this set of problems are structural, profound economic, political, cultural challenges that the regime faces. The economic challenges, in my view, are now the most important. And if you want, we can discuss them a little bit. They're almost biblical. The incompetence of this regime in managing the heritage that has been given, whether it is in nature, whether it's in Iran's water supply, whether it's Iran's human capital, whether it's Iran's oil, wealth, the squandering, the corruption is monumental. And as Lenin learned, as Mussolini learned, as every dictator in 20th century learned, you can fix a lot of things with the bayonet. You can't push the economy around. The economy has a way of forcing itself on you. That is what their biggest, in my view, challenge is now.
Great. I'd like us to turn to the economy in more detail in a minute, but just returning to the identity of the protesters, and you mentioned that these were the urban poor, the downtrodden, the ones who the regime has said that has been, supporting and providing services to. So there's some disagreement among scholars right now about if this was exactly the urban poor, or rather what Asif Bayat has called the middle class poor. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about it. And let me just explain that by the middle class poor, it's the people who are living the life of the poor economically, but have the credentials to aspire to middle class. So they have higher educational backgrounds. Their parents had higher living standards. They aspire to perhaps the standards that their parents had. And that with the opening of Iran's economy, this class has really benefited from educational opportunities. They were the generation of the 80s, but they have failed in the job market. So their expectations are very high, their livelihoods are less certain. Would you agree with that characterization, that the ones participating are perhaps this class of middle class poor, and that it is a new generational phenomenon?
Well, first of all, if we want to describe the middle class poor, it would include a lot more than those who came out in the streets, because the bulk of the Iranian middle class has now been impoverished by double-digit inflation, by drastic fall in the price of the Iranian currency. I mean, when I left Iran in 1987, a dollar would buy you 20 Persian tuman. Today, a dollar buys you 5,400 tuman. That's how much your wealth has fallen. So almost everybody, except those whose hand is in the till, and there are plenty of those, and those who are connected, who have made remarkable fortunes, have become impoverished. Iran is one of the most unequal, I think, economies in the world today, because there's a very small elite who has made wealth beyond their wildest dreams of avarice. There are more $1 million Porsches sold in Tehran than in the city of Toronto. There are more Lamborghinis sold in Tehran than London. And then you have at least half of the population, by regime's own standards, living under poverty. So you have a lot of people who fit that category. If we go by who was arrested, the categories that Asif Bayat has described, I don't think fits it. It's a little less educated. These are people who had high school education. These are, in terms of their age, they're they're between 20 to 25. So it is really the urban, poor, less educated, because Iran is a highly educated. I think one of the rare successes this regime has had is in expanding the education system, in almost eliminating illiteracy. There are 5 million college students in Iran. So those are remarkable numbers. But for the college educated woman, unemployment is 60%. And that in the smaller towns, that has begotten a lot of trouble for them.
So maybe let's turn to the economy, since I think it's impossible not to, when discussing the immediate term and the longer term causes of these protests. So many explanations of Iran's political economy post-1979 have relied on the Rentier state model, the idea that you have a state that has access to natural resources, that can extract them, and have them flow directly to the government, and that they can then finance powerful technologies with which to keep either people appeased or oppressed by financing massive security apparatuses. How apt do you think the Rentier state model is for understanding Iran after the 1979 revolution?
I think Iran was essentially a rentier state. That is a state that depended primarily on oil and gas for its foreign reserve and foreign currency. This regime, again, because of the sanctions, has had some success in reducing its reliance on oil and gas. They are now less than 50% reliant on oil and gas, but the 50% is diminishing. Their ability to find new oil, their ability to produce it, their ability to sell it, their ability for gas exploration is very seriously diminished. And the future of oil is very much in jeopardy. So countries like Iran, and I suspect Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates that depended on oil, need to rethink how they're going to plan their future. There's been very little serious long-term planning in Iran. They have essentially dug and sold and spent the money with very little to show for it, and an enormous amount of corruption. One of the, I think, remarkable things that happened is during the 8th year of Ahmadinejad presidency, Iran in that 8th year had about $700 billion in oil and gas revenues. To give that some context, from the first time oil was discovered in Iran and sold in 1908 till the end of Ahmadinejad presidency, the entire revenue of Iran was 1.3 trillion. 700 billion of that had come in that 8 years. And very little to show for it. As the government of Rouhani says, you don't have to rely on the opposition outside Iran. The government of Rouhani says, with that 700 billion, they haven't created a single new job. There are tens of billions of dollars lost. Some would put the figure of the amount of money lost over $150 billion. These are, again, the government's own figures. So an enormous opportunity to diversify, to create employment, to bring in capital was squandered. They wanted to bring last year, I think their plan was to bring in $100 billion in foreign investment. They actually brought in less than $4 billion. And if you're going to get out of double-digit unemployment, you need an infusion of massive capital. If you're going to bring the oil and gas to where it was in 1975, you need a massive infusion of foreign capital. And that ain't coming because there isn't stability.
So do you locate the beginning of this economic crisis in the Ahmadinejad years? Would you characterize what we're seeing as a break in the state-society sort of social contract that was promised in 1979? When would you date that break, if there ever was one?
Well, I think the break began very early on, maybe in 79, because they promised things that they couldn't deliver. Mr. Khomeini promised free housing for everyone, free oil and gas for everyone, no rents for everyone. These things were foolish utopian suggestions. They clearly couldn't deliver those, even if there wasn't a war. And then there was a war with Iraq, an 8-year war, absolute destructive war of the stupid, on both sides. Iraq was the invader. Iran continued it after 1982. For no good reason. Hundreds of millions of dollars have been lost on both sides. So in one sense, the breach goes back to the beginning. But I think the major problem occurred during Rafsanjani, where the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, were allowed to come into the economy. And the IRGC, which is a parallel military, has now become an economic juggernaut. Some suggest as much as 40% of the economy is in their hands. They bid on everything. They are in everything from housing to oil and gas to tourism to money laundering to printing underground illegal books. They're a big stake in the economy. They're much more of an economic factor than the Egyptian economy, that Egyptian military is in the Egyptian economy. And you can't have a viable economy if you have a kind of a gangster-like militarized militia that controls about 40% of the economy. Another 30-40% of the economy minimally is in the hands of these religious endowments, Waqf. They don't pay taxes. They act very much in a mafia manner. So the private sector that is to be the source of salvation is completely deprived of this ability to play any role. And the outside capital that could come in, and I'm just not talking about multinational. I'm talking about, for example, the Iranian diaspora, which is a very rich, successful, powerful economic force. They could help solve that problem, but they're not going back because there's no security. There's no stability. It's a mafia, gangster economy. Nobody's going to take billions of dollars in that atmosphere.
So some have said that another thing that happened in the Ahmadinejad years is what they describe as a hollowing out of the state and of the technocrats in the state. Would you agree with that, and would you describe it?
Absolutely. I think one of the constant temptations in Iran, very much akin to what happened in Soviet Union, for example, under Stalin, is this question of whether you need technocrats and managers to manage the economy and the factories and the bureaucracy, or you need people with ideological purity, piety. Ahmadinejad absolutely insisted on piety over expertise, and they virtually threw out, by one account, 20,000 mid-level and high-level managers, and brought in instead these semi-hoodlum, semi-pious, semi-militia, semi-devoted members of the IRGC, of the Basij, which is a street militia gang type of a force, and they put them in all these remarkably important economic positions. That hollowed out the economy as well as the bureaucracy.
So you've mentioned the sanctions. Let's talk about them a little bit more. So what has been the effect of the sanctions and also of the loosening of the sanctions, if we can call them that? And who are the winners and the losers domestically of this loosening?
I think the sanctions, once they became international, really began to hurt. Unilateral U.S. sanctions were not very effective because the regime very successfully bypassed them. Used Europe, they used Turkey, they used Russia, they used China, India, and in a way it gave them cover for their incompetence. Everything that they couldn't do, they said it's because of the sanctions. And because of the sanctions, they began to diversify. I said they have had some success in diversifying. But it deprived Iran of an enormous amount of wealth. It deprived Iran of a chance to expand its gas. It deprived Iran of the ability to enter the market of bringing in capital. Iran was adding to that in that very period where Iranian economy was suffering. Iran was also investing more and more money in Lebanon, in Syria, in keeping the Assad regime in power. So the economy was suffering. The end of the sanctions, the regime thought was going to help it a lot more than it in fact did. The claim by the President Trump that the Obama administration gave him $1.4 billion is essentially false. This is a money that was owed to Iran. Iran insisted on getting it. Every lawyer had told the U.S. administration that this money has to be paid. The fact that they paid it in cash was bad optics, maybe, but bad optics is not bad ethics, and the money was owed to them. But they were in need of a lot more than 1.4 billion. They needed a massive infusion of capital, and that money didn't come, partly because Iranian regime began, the radicals within the regime began saying, we're not going to allow foreigners to come back. IRGC began to say, no, we're not going to join the global market. We're going to keep this as it is. So that was not helpful. But then the Trump administration came, and it began to talk about reinstituting sanctions and ending the nuclear deal, ideas that were absurd from the beginning, in my view. That has meant that many of the Europeans that might have gone in for investments and brought money in, they haven't gone in. So the results of the end of sanction has been a lot less than the regime hoped for. And one of the problems that Mr. Rouhani faces is that he made great promises and hasn't been able to deliver.
Great. So maybe that's a good segue to talk a little bit about the regime, the elite, the different factions in the regime, and moving from the causes of the protests to the response of these protests. So what has the response been from the different factions in government, and what does it reveal about the state of factional politics today in Iran?
I think one of the most remarkable consequences of these recent demonstrations is the loss of credit by the reformists. The reformists, including Mr. Khatami, for example, a very popular ex-president, they were very late in supporting this movement. In fact, in the beginning, they said these are a bunch of hoodlums, this is foreign inspired, Israelis, the Americans, the United Arab Emirates, Saudis are doing this. They're louds, they're not real Iranians. And eventually they had to really fashion their message and say, no, these were disgruntled people. Maybe they were a little too violent. We should have paid more attention to them. But they lost a lot of credibility. The response has been very different depending on which faction. Khamenei, I think, and the conservatives have been willing to go full assault and suppress them, thinking that unless you suppress them, things are going to get out of hand. Rouhani and his government have believed that if you assault this, if you go against this, you might trigger more. So they have been in a state of indecision, I think, in all of this. Clearly, the regime is divided on what to do about this movement, what to do about the women's movement, what to do about capital, what to do about conservation. They've just created a fiasco for themselves. They arrested a group of people, accused them of being advocates ostensibly advocates of conservation, but really tools of foreign conspiracy, tools of the U.S. espionage, tools of Israeli espionage. Lizards have now become spies. One professor, really some of the most absurd things you would not even hear in Stalinist Russia, that the United States would use lizards to detect the level of uranium. And there are a number of people in prison. We laugh at it. And one person has died. One person has been killed in prison. A very prominent professor has been killed in prison. Professor Sayyid Emami. There are several other professors and activists. Their only ostensible crime is defending conservation. So they keep creating these rather strange conspiracies, and they want to go after them. But the Rouhani camp seems to suggest that a more conciliatory approach would be more productive.
Mm-hmm. So, speaking of Rouhani's camp, is this a critical juncture for the reformist bloc? So we're coming on, or I think we just passed the 20th anniversary of Khatami's election, the emergence of the reformist bloc. Maybe it's a good time to think back and evaluate what the strengths and weaknesses, what the contributions and limitations of the reformists have been.
I think this will turn out to be a historic juncture for them. I think they miss a very important moment by not joining and supporting the movement early on. I think some of the rhetoric that they had to walk back, all of it, has been very, very counterproductive for them. And I think a lot of people are saying in Iran that 20 years of trial has failed. You haven't delivered, the reformists haven't delivered. And an element that has made the situation for the reformists more complicated is the re-emergence of Mr. Ahmadinejad, the infamous Mr. Ahmadinejad, as a claimant to the new mantle of a leader of the opposition. He has just recently, 2 days ago, he issued a letter directed to Khamenei and made some really remarkable critique of the regime. He has been increasingly vocal in saying that the status quo is dead, we have to change it, and pointing the finger to Mr. Khamenei, saying you are responsible. So you have the reformists, you have the principalists, as they're called them, although they really don't have many principles. Their principle is conservatism and keeping the status quo. And you now have this new phenomenon. Nobody knows what to call them except Ahmadinejadism.
Mm-hmm. So corruption is something that's openly talked about by the protesters, but it's also become something that increasingly regimes are using, not just in Iran, but across the Middle East, in opposition to one another, so as part of elite factional politics. How does corruption and economic mismanagement play out in these factional politics?
I think they play a very important role. Iran is, according to Transparency International, for example, that measures the level of corruption in the country, one of the most corrupt countries in the world. I think it's the lowest 10, where you don't want to be. But I think, and in that sense, there's constant bickering on who is more corrupt, who has stolen more, how many billions Ahmadinejad stole, how many billions the reformists have stolen. But there's something else, I think, that is more structural, and that is the mismanagement of the heritage that was given to this regime. The mismanagement of the water, for example. Iran faces a biblical water shortage. The entire region is facing water shortage. This water shortage is not their creation, but the way they have gone at the water system, the way they have taken almost 70% of the water reservoirs that have been in Iran for several thousand years. And they've done it not to produce something, they've done it as mismanagement, as corruption. The local police looking the other way if somebody is digging a well deep to produce watermelon to then export to United Arab Emirates. All of this is now becoming a subject of public discussion. The internet is helping. The fact that people have access to this information. One of the good things Rouhani government did was for the first time they put the budget online and everybody could find out what was being spent on what. And people suddenly realized how much money, for example, was being given to these religious schools. That created a remarkable level of anger. The fact that now everybody has a cell phone. Iran has 55 million smartphones. There are 110 million SIM cards. For every Iranian, there seems to be 1.5 SIM card. And they're constantly taking images. Every time a police beats somebody, there's an image of it. There's an image of it just today. A woman took off her veil, stood on a public square, a thug come police, threw her down. There are hundreds of images of it in the internet.
So far, despite all this action on social media, and social media perhaps serving as a way for protests to spread, the protests have lacked unified leadership, effective organization, and maybe clearly, some would say even clearly defined objectives. They've also failed to galvanize a broad coalition of class and political forces. So this time, the urban middle class not being involved. In 2009, the opposite being the case. Why do we see the absence of cross-class coalitions in Iran still?
I think several reasons. One is when the regime is brutal and oppressive, it clearly does not allow organizations to thrive. It doesn't allow networks. It doesn't allow gatherings of people. It doesn't allow political parties. Political parties are virtually illegal in Iran. You can't, although the constitution allows it, you can't have it. So you can't organize in that sense. But social networks are allowing people to organize. And the social networks are remarkably agile in Iran. The numbers are incredible. The number of people who are on Instagram, who are on Telegram, who are on Twitter, who are on Facebook, all of them illegal, all of them filtered, all of them used by the Iranian people in a remarkable way. I mean, there was one station that was very important in those demonstrations. The regime filed a complaint, and I think they were right, saying that this Telegram channel has advocated violence. Instagram immediately shut it down. At the time they shut it down, they had 1 million subscribers. Within an hour, they had 1.5 million subscribers. They changed their name, added a 1 next to it, and invited everybody to rejoin. That's how agile that system is. And Facebook, Twitter, all of these things, and the regime knows, and it can't completely shut it down. So I think you're absolutely right. The problem of organization is there. But there's one other difference, I think. And in my view, it's because women have a very important role in defining the ideology of this movement. There is more prudence to this movement than there was in 1979. Our generation believed it doesn't matter what comes next, overthrow the Shah, whatever comes will be better. This generation doesn't believe that. They believe we have to first think of what the option is and then move. There's prudence. And the regime very, very actively promotes the idea that if you continue demonstrating, Iran will become Syria. Avoiding the Syrian fate is very much on the mind of almost everyone I know of who goes onto the streets. The regime literally, at the heat of the demonstrations, put on these big billboards around the cities with images of destroyed Syrian towns, never mentioning that they helped very much destroy those towns. They were very key elements of destroying those towns, along with Russia and the Assad regime. These were the three who kept the Assad regime there. But nevertheless, they said, this is what happened to peaceful demonstrations who continued. If you want Syria, continue.
Has the intervention in the very pivotal intervention of Iran and the continuing tragedy that we're seeing unfold in Syria, how else has that affected domestic politics in Iran?
Well, I think many people protested the fact that Iran was spending so much human capital, so much financial capital, and as soon as the word got out about this opposition, some of the, again, because of the openness, some of the numbers have been remarkable. I mean, I have been trying to figure out how much money they spend. It's very difficult to get an exact figure. But last year alone, there were 2,000 Afghan soldiers recruited by the Iranian regime, paid by the Iranian regime, sent to fight in Syria, who've been killed, 7,000 injured. So you have almost 9,000 killed and injured. How many were there? And we know they pay for them. Iran pays for them. We know it by fact. We know that they give citizenship to Afghan citizens who go fight. Iranians have a very bad attitude toward Afghan, almost as bad as Donald Trump's attitude towards illegal, quote-unquote, immigrants here. That's the way they treat illegal Afghans. They're offered full citizenship and coverage for their family for life if they fight. So there's a lot of investment of money there. And that's becoming politicized. Why are we spending that much money there? What is Iran's interest in Syria and not helping the Iranian economy?
So we've been collecting some great questions from the audience here, and I would like to bring them into our conversation. So there are a few questions about the role of local religious leaders and whether they did anything to support the protest or whether they're all falling in line with national religious leadership.
Very few, as far as I know, very few local religious leaders openly supported the movement. Many of the local religious leaders tried to side with the regime because that's where the bread is buttered. There was some report, and I think it's credible report, that the first Mashhad demonstrations that you referred to might have been initially instigated by two local religious leaders who are very powerful, very conservative. One of them, who is his son-in-law, Raisi, lost the election to Rouhani, and they might have instigated the initial. That's the only evidence I have ever seen. The rest of them have lined up behind the regime.
Okay. So another question or series of questions get us to talk about the future of the nuclear deal. And maybe we can move to talk more broadly about Iranian foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy, and U.S.-Iran relations. So before we get into the specifics of the nuclear deal, how would you characterize the Trump administration's foreign policy towards Iran as part of a broader strategy in the Middle East?
I've been trying to figure out what that strategy is. And I have been...
You don't think there's a Trump doctrine?
I don't think so. I don't think there is a Trump doctrine on Iran, other than saying that I was right to oppose the deal. I don't know why he thinks he was right. I think the Trump administration is clearly divided between what Mr. Trump tweets, what McMaster thinks, what Mattis knows, and what Tillerson wants. And these four do not cohere into one strategy. I have absolutely no idea what it is that they want to do in the region. With the nuclear deal, for example, the idea that the U.S. would unilaterally walk away from the deal is almost, to use his hyperbole, the worst idea ever in history. Mm-hmm. Because it doesn't get anybody anything. It doesn't get the United States what it wants, because Europe is clearly sticking with the deal. Russia and China are clearly sticking with the deal. Iran is clearly playing it absolutely safe, so that the IAEA is about to issue a statement, I think it's coming out tomorrow, saying Iran has abided by all of its requirements. So the deal is going to survive whether the Trump administration walks away from it or not. But what they want to do, I really, I've been very much trying to figure out, and I haven't figured out. I don't know what their strategy on Iran, except, to their credit, I have to say, the fact that they supported, the fact that Donald Trump and the State Department were very clear in saying that we support the demonstrations, we support the demonstrators, we support the right of the people to demonstrate. I thought that was a very good gesture. I disagree with almost everything Donald Trump has said about Iran. His idea of calling the Persian Gulf the Arabic Gulf, the idea of walking away from the nuclear deal. All of these things are things that I have been very critical of. But nevertheless, as the President of the United States, that office has a certain authority still, a certain legitimacy. And when that office says, we are behind the people of Iran, and if the regime shoots at innocent people, we're going to hold you accountable, that means something. And it meant something when one of Iran's most brutal judges went to Germany, and a human rights group filed a lawsuit against him as a criminal. The German government was essentially forced to throw him out of the country. That, I think, is a very interesting. It wouldn't have happened if the NGOs didn't think that the Trump administration was behind this. So I don't know what they're trying to do. Almost everything they've done has been counter to what I think the U.S. should do. But supporting the rights of the people to demonstrate, I think, is a good thing. It needs more humility. It needs to be clearly indicated that the United States is not in the business of determining who the next government of Iran is, that the United States is not about to try to change the regime in Iran. But the next step, to say clearly, categorically, we are not going to forget if you shoot at innocent people with heavy guns.
Mm-hmm. So I guess some might say that if the nuclear deal survives, then we can safely say that perhaps U.S. policy under Trump is the same U.S. policy we have seen for several decades, other than the verbal, maybe bellicosity of it. If we think about what the pillars of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East have been, so security of Israel, security of oil, and the containing Iran through the Gulf. Do you see any of those pillars changing? So some argued that under the Trump administration, the logic had started to change, that perhaps thinking about U.S. dependence on oil decreasing in the near future, the U.S. becoming oil self-sufficient, that would be a big change for the region, and also that even a withdrawal from the region was something that the Trump administration was starting to do, and the pivot towards Asia for clear strategic reasons. But yeah, how would you place what we've seen the Trump administration do if we think about those pillars?
I think with the exception of the idea that the defense of Israel is an essential part of the U.S. strategy in the Middle East, which has been part of every administration almost, I don't think there is continuity between Obama and the Trump administration. For example, the Trump administration, to a lesser extent, I think the Bush administration, both Bush administrations, the Clinton administration, to more or less the same degree, they realized that if you're going to have stability and long-term stability in the Middle East, you need to balance the presence of Iran and Saudi Arabia. The Trump administration has completely sided with Saudi Arabia. The Obama administration, in the view of the Saudis, had completely sided with Iran. The Persian Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, all the Sunnis really believed that the Trump administration has formed an alliance with Iran against them. Now, I don't think he had. I don't think Obama administration had, although I think the Obama administration, in my view, was wrong. And I said it here before, I repeat it, I think they were wrong in not supporting the 2009 movement of the people more forcefully. He thought that they needed the nuclear deal, and if they talk about human rights, Khamenei will walk. I don't think he would have walked, but it doesn't matter if he had walked. I think it's moral responsibility of the United States to have said, we defend the right of the Iranian people to ask for free elections. He was very late, he was very reluctant, and many in the region saw this as a complete pivot to Shiite Iran. Now people, the Saudis, see it as a repivot to the Sunnis and an attempt to contain Iran. I think the Middle East won't have peace unless the Saudis and the Iranians get off their high horse of supporting proxies, supporting religious groups, limiting the amount of money they spend on promoting radical Islam. The Saudis spend even more than the Iranians do. And unless both do, we're not going to see peace in the Middle East.
So speaking of Iranian and Saudi foreign policy and this geostrategic, Cold War that we've been witnessing for many years, given that they are now the two large powers with the fall of Iraq and the fall of Egypt as great regional powers. How would you characterize the success of Iranian foreign policy through proxy wars vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia's?
I think they have had short-term success because they have been able to essentially create a lot of trouble for Saudi Arabia with a lot less money than the Saudis and a lot less involvement than the Saudis have had. For example, in Yemen, Iran has been able to create a lot more trouble for Saudis in Yemen with the expenditure of much less. The regime is very successful. The Iranian regime has been very successful in picking the right proxies and giving them what they need to create the necessary trouble they want for their foes, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it's the United States, whether it is in Israel. But in the longer term, I don't think that policy is successful because now virtually the only ally Iran has in the region, if you don't think about Iran as this regime, if you think about Iran as a country, the only ally Iran has in the region is the Assad regime. and it's the Assad regime that relies on Iran for its survival. The Saudis have a larger coalition. Iran has remained isolated, dependent on its proxies and the goodwill of Assad regime that has its hand up to its elbow in the blood of Syrians, as do others. I mean, unfortunately, everybody has done the Syrian people a great deal of injustice. And the Yemenis, both of these, I think they will go down in history, and all of us will go down in history as having stood by silently and seeing all of this. This is far more tragic than what happened in Spain in 1937. And everybody is still talking about the silence of the genocide or the attacks, the Guernica killings. There's several 100,000 children on the verge of dying, on the verge of cholera in Yemen. Where is the anger? Where is the moral disgust about this? Nothing. And the responsibility is not just the Saudis, the Iranians are responsible because they also fired this, but we too are responsible in keeping silent about it.
Let's take another question from the audience. This one is about Iran-Israel relations. So we've spoken about it a little bit through the lens of U.S. foreign policy, but how would you characterize Iran-Israel relations today?
Extremely tense, almost as bad as it could get. In Syria, they almost came to war 10 days ago, when, by all accounts, Hezbollah or Iranian IRGC, nobody knows which one, very provocatively sent the drone into Israel. And Israel very forcefully reacted, bombed the Iranian base. But Iran decided to keep silent about it. They haven't said much about the fact that they lost personnel and they lost a lot of, because neither one wants, I think, a major confrontation. Although Mr. Netanyahu, I think, is now fighting for his political life. And as Shakespeare said many centuries ago, keep giddy minds busy with foreign wars. But in Israel, as well as in Iran, I think there are forces who don't want to engage in what would be, I think, a very, very costly battle. Mm-hmm. So I think the relationship as bad as it could possibly be. But my hope is there won't be a military confrontation, although they almost came to one in Syria.
Right. Do you think we are any closer to a direct confrontation than we have been in the past?
We were, and I have been worried, but I think if you read the rhetoric that is coming out of Iran, the way they handled all of this, and the way Russia has handled, one of the forces, one of the actors that we don't really talk about, but we should, is how Russia is playing all of this. Russia is on a march in the Middle East. Nobody pays attention to it. Everybody talks about how President Trump doesn't talk about Russian intervention in U.S. elections, but he's also not talking about Russian march in the Middle East, in Syria, in Turkey, in almost everywhere. And now they're repivoting, I think, just in the last 2-3 days, in the relationship between Iran and Israel. 2 days ago, in a meeting in Moscow, when Zarif was sitting, almost as close as you're sitting to me, Lavrov gave a talk and said, this nonsense about the destruction of Israel and how Israel should be wiped off the map is not acceptable to us. That was as serious of a slight pivot towards Israel, and as much a message to Israel that if you want to distance yourself from the United States, you have a friend on this side. And the Palestinians are essentially doing the same thing, organizing a peace conference, international peace conference, that the U.S. might not even be invited to. These are serious consequences. What the Russian influence in Iran is serious long-term strategic realignment. And nobody that I know of seems to be as worried about it as I am.
We have another question from the audience about returning to the role of women and the women's movement, which, let me just say, in defense, when I mentioned the 3 large protest cycles, I meant uprisings, not movements, social movements. I think due has to be given to women fighting for their rights in Iran, and I will be the last not to put central focus on that. But so the question is about who the women are who are leading today's women's movements, and specifically about their levels of education, and are these the daughters of those who read Lolita in Tehran?
Well, first of all, I apologize. I didn't mean at all to put you on a defensive. I know you're a fierce advocate of women's movement, but women on every level, in my view, are fighting for their rights, which includes economic rights, which includes political rights, which includes the right to determine their own dress, which includes the right to determine whether they want to stay married or not. It is a remarkable fight. It really is remarkable. I think, to me, it's one of the most epic fights of the 20th century and 21st century. And the left has paid very little attention to it because the left has thought that these issues are part of the larger class struggle. The right has denigrated it as being women being elements of the Western corrupted ideas, that these are all Western ideas. But this is a remarkable overall movement against misogyny, against inequality, against forced hijab, against inequality in pay, against inequality in the number of unemployed, against violence against women in marriages, against shamefully legal, unequal laws of divorce, on almost every front. And they fight it very methodically, and they begin at the, sort of the most elemental level. They know what the feminist movement later articulated in the political idea that the private is political. They're fighting the private life, and they're fighting the public life. There's a movement going on. Women appearing in streets, young, this is almost all young ladies, appear on street corners, take their scarf out, put it on a stick, and say, I don't want to force hijab. They get busted, they get spent in prison. The first one who was arrested was given 500 million tuman bail. 500 million tuman. That's almost like 130,000. It depends because the rate constantly changes. And women continue going. The regime was so flustered because women would go on these sort of electrical routers, stand on a router on the street corner, take their scarf out. So they began to put these kinds of cones on these routers so women can't stand on them. I mean, that's how frustrated they are. And go from there to every level. There are some women who oppose this movement. They're conservative women. I don't want to suggest that there is absolute unanimous opinion, but the sustained power of this movement, to me, is one of the most heroic things in modern Iranian history. And if there is one thing that has broken the back of terror, it is the women's movement. Because if in a terror-based regime, you can show that terror can be beaten, if you can beat fear in terror regime, you have beat that regime. And women have beaten that fear. They're absolutely fearless. They read a lot more than just Lolita. But also Lolita.
Final question. What would you say is the most understudied topic or question in Iran right now that as academics we should be looking at? Like, what are we missing and what should we be investing in learning about?
My sense is that the sustained underground resistance, cultural, political, economic, aesthetic, sexual, theater, cinema, that is going on in Iran at all levels. Iran today is Prague 1968. They are fighting this regime in an ideological way. The way it is remarkable. I teach a course, we were talking about this at Stanford every 2 years. It's called Aesthetics of Dissent. It's about how everything, from how you dress, to how much hair you show, to what films you see, to how you engage in social media, in how you choose your partner. On all of these levels, there is a sustained, powerful tsunami of cultural resistance. There's almost all ignored because everybody is concerned about what happens at the tip of the political structure. That's important. But as Foucault taught us many, many decades ago, what happens at the cellular level, what happens at the societal level is also very important, and that gets very little study.
Mm-hmm. So before we open up the floor for discussion with those of you here in the room, I would like to say goodnight to our radio listeners, and thank you, Dr. Milani, for this excellent discussion. Many thanks as well to you, the audience, for your terrific questions. And
Thank you.